"Get her off my stage! She's blind! She'll damage the Steinway!" With those cruel words, the world almost missed a miracle. If you're new here, please hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The voice cracked through the concert hall like a whip, arrogant and sharp, slicing through the gentle hum of pre-show conversation. Gasps fluttered across the room as heads turned toward the commotion. At the center of it all, beneath the harsh glow of a crystal chandelier, stood a young girl, motionless. Her face was pale but calm, her lips pressed together tightly in quiet determination. She held a white cane loosely in one hand, while her other hovered just inches above the polished black surface of a grand piano. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. But something in the set of her delicate chin refused to yield. The man who had spoken, dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit, stepped forward. Victor Bell, a name carved into classical music history. The kind of performer who could silence rooms with a single keystroke. His silver hair and icy blue eyes radiated command. People bowed when he entered spaces like this. His hands were insured for millions, and now those same hands pointed dismissively at the girl before him. "She doesn't belong on that bench," he said, half to the stage manager, half to the dozens of elite guests already seated. "She's blind, for heaven's sake. She'll damage it." "Sir," came a tentative voice from behind the curtain, "she just asked to touch the keys. She's not even scheduled to." "I don't care," Victor barked. "You don't let a child play in traffic just because she wants to drive. Get her off my stage." The girl still hadn't moved. Her eyes, milky with clouded pupils, stared somewhere just past the piano. She looked younger than she was, perhaps 14 or 15, but something about her presence defied fragility. Her slender shoulders trembled just slightly, but her back remained straight. Though her body was small and fragile, her hands were elegant and long, the hands of someone meant to create sound. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice floating across the stage like a leaf on still water. Her tone was soft, yet carried the weight of something bruised but unbroken. "No need to be dramatic," Victor replied coldly, already turning his back. From the wings, someone recorded the exchange. A security guard off duty, phone halfway in his coat pocket. He hadn't meant to film, not really, but something about the girl's stillness made his thumb press record almost involuntarily. She stepped back, placing her cane in front of her again. There was no shaking in her hands, no moisture in her eyes. Her expression was calm, but her lips were tight, holding back something deeper. The hush in the room deepened, not respectful silence, but that uncomfortable, sticky quiet that follows cruelty in public. People shifted in their seats. Someone coughed, a few whispered. Then she turned and walked away. Nobody knew her name. Not yet. 2 years earlier, Arya Bellamy had been just another invisible figure in the marble-lined corridors of Eastbrook Conservatory. The kind of place where students' surnames mattered more than their talents. Most students came from generational wealth. Ambassadors' children, retired ballet legends, sons and daughters of global conductors. Arya came with nothing. No mother, no father, just a plain caseworker who dropped her off at the campus gate in a single suitcase filled with threadbare clothes, a metronome with no battery, and a half-broken Braille reader. The conservatory didn't technically admit her. She was there under a program called Silent Observer, a euphemism for keeping her far from stages or classrooms, but allowing her to soak up the inspiration. She soaked it up all right, from outside practice rooms through doors left ajar, from vibrations in the floorboards when pianists practiced upstairs. She spent her afternoons sitting cross-legged in the hallway outside Professor Alcott's lecture room, tracing music with her fingers in the air, every muscle in her hands twitching with invisible chords. It was Alcott who first noticed. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence, but one evening as rain poured so loudly on the conservatory's arched glass roof that even practice became impossible, he saw her sitting there, hands suspended midair, eyes closed following a silent rhythm. He leaned down. "Are you mimicking my lecture?" "I was trying," she said. "I'm sorry." "For what?" he asked. She hesitated. "For being here." Alcott blinked. The hallway smelled of old stone and varnished wood. Thunder growled outside. "Don't be sorry," he said. "Be precise." From that day forward, when his students had gone and the lights dimmed low, Alcott stayed behind. He taught her not with printed scores, but with stories, describing how a fugue should feel like chasing your own shadow, or how Debussy was like water running downhill, unpredictable, fluid, free. He pressed her fingers into wood to explain the weight of a chord, tapped out syncopations on her knuckles, hummed scales into her ear until she could feel pitch without hearing it, and Arya absorbed everything with terrifying speed. But talent in a place like Eastbrook was not enough. When the conservatory announced its Young Virtuoso Showcase, Alcott filled out the application for her himself. He didn't list her disability. He listed her name, her skill, and a private recommendation so glowing it bordered on a prayer. She was allowed to audition, technically. Her assigned time slot was 7:45 a.m., before most faculty had even arrived. The piano she was told to use was the old, slightly out-of-tune Baby Grand in the East rehearsal wing, not the concert Steinway. A single judge came to listen. No audience, no welcome. Arya sat in silence for a long time before placing her fingers on the keys. When she began to play, she didn't just reproduce music. She summoned it, transformed it. The piece, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, rose from the piano like a living thing, massive, aching, and unspeakably tender. When she was done, the judge nodded curtly and left without a word. She never received a call back, and Arya disappeared from the conservatory's halls. What she didn't know, what no one told her, was that someone had been watching. The janitor who cleaned the wing every morning had paused outside the door. He had heard what the judge heard, but unlike the judge, he was moved. That night, he uploaded the video he'd quietly taken, titled it, Blind Girl Rejected by Conservatory Plays Rachmaninoff by Heart. The video didn't explode immediately, but a few days later, a piano blogger in Berlin reposted it, then a music therapist in Argentina, then a retired cellist in Brooklyn. The shares tripled by the hour. Comments poured in from every continent. She plays like she's telling her own story, one wrote. I felt that in my chest. The conservatory board panicked, not publicly but behind closed doors. Furious meetings were held. One particularly nervous administrator asked if they could track her IP address. Another reminded them that she didn't have an IP address. She didn't even own a phone. She was unreachable. Until she wasn't. An envelope arrived at the conservatory's front desk, hand-delivered, gilded edges, from the International Gala of Human Harmony, a global concert broadcast to over 60 countries. This year's theme, Breaking Barriers in Sound. They wanted Arya Bellamy to open the show. The dean choked on his espresso. It wasn't a request. It was a declaration. A spotlight had been cast, and for the first time, Arya was no longer a hidden shadow in the back hallway. She would share the same stage as Victor Bell himself. And Victor did not take the news well. She'll ruin the program's integrity. Victor's voice was low, calm, almost pleasant. Too calm, the way a winter wind can be quiet right before it bites. He spoke to the gala's director, an elderly man named Gerard Morrow, whose career had spanned every corner of global music diplomacy. The two were standing near the edge of the stage during a pre-rehearsal walkthrough in Vienna's Grand Harmony Hall. She's a child, blind, untrained. It's political. You know it is. Gerard raised an eyebrow, his French-accented voice carrying just enough steel to remind Victor he wasn't speaking to a sycophant. And yet the world is waiting to hear her. Or haven't you seen the numbers? Victor exhaled, sharp and slow. This isn't a talent show. No, Gerard replied, smiling faintly. It's a reckoning. Somewhere across the city, Arya Bellamy stood barefoot in the quiet of her hotel suite. The floor beneath her toes was cool marble, veined like river branches frozen in time. She tilted her head slightly as she listened to the wind against the window, then to the silence between the gusts. Even in unfamiliar cities, she mapped her world through sound, the low growl of distant traffic, the high-pitched stutter of a faulty elevator 2 floors above, the tiny, irregular tapping of a tree branch against the glass. It all fit together like an unspoken score. Professor Alcott had flown with her despite no longer holding any official title. He refused to leave her side, even when the conservatory tried to replace him with a flashier manager. You know, he'd whispered during the flight, in all my years I never imagined I'd be flying across the world with the finest pianist I ever taught, and one the school never admitted. Arya smiled softly. They admitted my footsteps. That's something. He chuckled. You always did play with the quiet kind of defiance. The rehearsal was scheduled for the following afternoon. Arya had not yet touched the piano, not since the day she'd walked off that stage. She hadn't dared, not because of fear, but because something inside her had shifted. Playing used to be her escape, her way of folding the world into melody when life refused to be kind. But now the world wanted to listen, not as background noise, not as indulgence, but as truth. And the weight of that was immense. Still, when the moment came, when the doors to the rehearsal hall opened and the spotlight swept down from the rafters like a blade of light, she didn't hesitate. She stepped forward calmly with Alcott at her side until her fingers brushed the edge of the piano bench. It was the same make she'd always dreamed of, a Steinway D concert grand. The finish was cold, smooth, untouched. Her fingers trembled just for a moment, then fell still. And then she sat. Every sound in the hall retreated. Even the dust seemed to pause. She placed her hands on the keys but didn't play. She simply held the silence in her palms, stretching it, commanding it until it bent to her will. And then, with a breath so quiet it barely belonged to her, she began. The notes that spilled out weren't from any known sonata or concerto. They didn't follow a familiar pattern. No famous composer had inked them centuries ago. They were hers, raw, unscored, born in that exact moment, a blend of memory and invention. She began with a single sustained G, soft, uncertain, like a child reaching into a dark room. Then a ripple of triplets down the right hand followed by a broken chord progression that sounded like sunlight filtered through grief. The left hand moved slowly, deliberately, more felt than heard. Those present, technicians, ushers, even the man fixing a rigging cable, stood frozen. No one gave a cue. No one dared to interrupt. Even Victor, standing near the wings, had stopped mid-sentence when the music began. He didn't move. His eyes narrowed. There was something haunting about it, something unsettling. She's not reading from anything, he thought. Not even muscle memory. This is pure invention. No one plays like this without being broken first. And then it dawned on him. She wasn't broken. He was. The melody morphed, a sudden shift. Minor chords now, melancholy notes rising in wounded defiance. Her body leaned forward slightly as if pulled by invisible threads. Her face was serene, not joyful, not pained, just open, like a door left ajar during a storm. Then, without warning, she stopped mid-chord. Her hands hovered. No resolution, no applause, just silence. And that silence thundered through the chamber like the aftermath of war. The rehearsal director stepped forward, stunned. "Miss Bellamy, will that be your piece for the gala?" She tilted her head, considering. "No," she said. "That was just a warm-up." Victor clenched his jaw. The next day, the gala director received a request from Victor Bell's agent. He wanted to change the performance order. Victor no longer wished to follow Arya's set. He wanted to open instead. The request was denied. Meanwhile, news of Arya's rehearsal leaked. Somehow, someone had taken a short audio clip on their phone and posted it to a classical music forum. The clip, just 45 seconds long, was shared over 3 million times in 12 hours. Headlines followed: "The blind virtuoso who doesn't read music," "The girl who silenced a concert hall," "Rachmaninoff reincarnated? No, Bellamy begins." Victor spent the night in restless pacing, not out of jealousy, not exactly, but fear. Not of her, but of something deeper, of irrelevance, of watching his legacy get eclipsed not by time, but by a girl who played with a kind of purity he hadn't touched in decades. He hadn't played from truth in so long he'd forgotten what it sounded like. And now all he had was perfection. She had something else. On the morning of the gala, the Grand Harmonique Hall buzzed like a beehive of silk and diamonds. Diplomats, royalty, philanthropists, critics, and composers filled every velvet seat. The orchestra tuned beneath golden archways. Cameras were locked in. Backstage, Victor warmed up alone, his fingers dancing over the keys with practiced flair. Every note exact, every tempo obeyed. He didn't realize that just one room over, Arya sat with her fingers in her lap, doing nothing but breathing, listening, mapping the resonance of the concert hall by its breathing, feeling the vibrations from the floor as the audience shuffled in. She didn't need sight. She could feel the weight of thousands. Professor Alcott stood beside her, quietly holding her cane. "Are you afraid?" he whispered. She shook her head gently. "No," she said. "I've already played my hardest song. This one is just truth." He smiled. "Then give it to them." She nodded, then stood. A stagehand opened the side curtain. It was time. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer's voice boomed across the opulent auditorium. Please welcome to the stage, Arya Bellamy. A ripple of curiosity ran through the audience. Some leaned forward, brows raised. Others tilted their heads toward their programs, flipping pages to find the unfamiliar name. A few whispered to their neighbors. Most had never heard of her. Those who had seen the viral video from weeks before now sat motionless, anticipation bubbling under their skin like a drawn breath that couldn't be released. The house lights dimmed. A single beam of warm gold spilled down from the rafters onto the stage, illuminating the grand Steinway that stood like a monolith of sound, waiting to be awakened. And then she appeared, not in a dramatic entrance, no fanfare, no sweeping dress. Just Arya, barefoot in a simple black gown, one hand gently resting on Professor Alcott's arm, the other loosely holding her white cane. The audience watched in reverent silence as she approached the piano, her steps slow, deliberate, but without a hint of fear. Her head turned slightly as she counted the spacing. Alcott guided her gently to the bench, then stepped back into the shadows like a guardian who had fulfilled his purpose. Arya sat for a moment. She didn't move. Her hands lay in her lap, and her head bowed. Not in submission, but in communion, like a priest before the altar or a soldier before the storm. The silence became sacred, and then, barely audible, she inhaled. Her fingers rose and hovered, and they began to play. But what came wasn't a recognizable prelude. Not Chopin, not Beethoven, not Bach. No one in the audience could name it because it had no name. It was something else, something older than sheet music, deeper than memory. It was a story. The right hand fluttered in ripples across the upper register, delicate notes that danced like raindrops skipping across glass. They were playful, hesitant, childlike. The left hand joined a moment later, slow and rich, anchoring the melody with the gravity of a father's absence, a mother's voice lost in time. Those in the audience who had seen hardship felt it instantly. The trembling start, the notes stumbling, searching, then suddenly finding clarity. A rising scale that soared briefly triumphant, then collapsed again into minor keys that sounded like unanswered prayers. It was not a performance. It was remembrance. A sigh from the front row broke the air. An ambassador's wife dabbed her cheek with the corner of her glove. A young violinist in the balcony leaned so far forward that his glasses fell from his face and clattered onto the floor below. But no one shushed him. No one moved. Because now Arya's tempo shifted. The chords thickened. Her fingers struck the keys with unexpected power, percussive bursts that thundered like fists pounding against a locked door. Her entire body moved with the sound, shoulders tight, spine bowed. The rhythm became defiant, angry, alive. This was no longer just memory. It was resistance. The music seemed to cry out, I was never given a chance. You look past me. You shut your doors. But I'm still here. Each crescendo struck like a confession. Each diminuendo left a vacuum, drawing the crowd in closer. Even Victor, watching from the green room through a live monitor, had frozen mid-step. He had one hand on the tuning keys of his own piano, but he wasn't touching them now. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes narrowed. She had no sheet music, no orchestra, no conductor, and yet she commanded every soul in the room like a maestro. Halfway through the piece, Arya slowed. Her left hand dropped out entirely, and with her right, she began a single melody, a simple, wistful sequence in E major. It drifted upward, climbing as if trying to touch the stars. She repeated it once, twice, and then she changed it, just slightly. A single note bent downward, another skipped entirely. And suddenly, those listening understood. This was her mother's lullaby. Untrained ears couldn't tell, but those with childhoods full of soft singing, of gentle rocking under moonlight, recognized it at once. And it shattered them. The notes faded. The hall was utterly still. Arya held the final chord so lightly it was almost a breath, then released it into nothing. No motion, no bow. She sat with her hands on her knees, facing the audience without seeing them, but knowing exactly what she'd left in their chests. And then the thunder came. Applause erupted like a dam bursting. It wasn't polite, it was primal. Chairs scraped backward. Some stood, others shouted. There were tears in places that had not known weeping in decades. The ovation rolled like a wave, sweeping the room in a fever of awe and disbelief. Cameras panned from face to face, critics, conductors, heads of state, each with expressions torn wide open. A voice cried from the balcony, "Encore!" Another followed, "Arya, Arya!" She didn't rise. She didn't react. She simply turned her face upward toward the lights, as if listening to the sound not with her ears, but with her skin. Backstage, Victor turned from the monitor and poured himself a drink with shaking hands. "They won't remember me tonight," he muttered. "They'll remember her." He wasn't wrong. In the hours that followed, the gala's live stream shattered viewership records. News outlets scrambled for information. Social media exploded with clips, commentary, tributes. Composers posted reaction videos. Critics published emergency editorials calling her performance a once-in-a-century expression of the human spirit. By morning, Arya Bellamy's name was the top trending search in over 20 countries. And she had no idea. In her quiet hotel room, far from the glow of fame, Arya sat cross-legged on the carpet, her hands resting in her lap. Professor Alcott sat across from her, his cup of tea untouched. "Was it enough?" she asked softly. He leaned forward, voice low and reverent. "You didn't just play music, Arya. You changed its shape." She tilted her head. "But I didn't finish the story." He smiled. "No, because now the world will be asking for more." In the days that followed, offers flooded in, record deals, world tours, exclusive contracts. But Arya declined them all. When pressed for a reason, she offered only this. "Do you know what the word prelude means?" she asked softly. "It means an introduction to something larger, something that hasn't happened yet. Tonight wasn't the story. It was just the prelude." Years later, people would argue over Arya Bellamy's legacy. Some would call her the greatest pianist of her generation. Others would say she was a teacher, a healer, a ghost who turned silence into song. But those who truly listened, they would say she was a bridge between the seen and unseen, the heard and the silenced, the wounded and the wonder. She never returned to the grand stages or to the glittering halls of fame. Instead, she traveled to places where music was a luxury, refugee camps, children's hospitals, remote villages. She played not for applause, but for the only audience that ever truly mattered, those who needed to be reminded that they, too, had a voice. And in doing so, she taught the world something it had forgotten. Sometimes the most powerful notes are the ones that emerge from silence. As for Victor Bell, he would eventually hang up his tuxedo and start teaching, not at Eastbrook, but at a small community center that welcomed students without auditions or pedigrees. When asked why he'd walked away from fame, his answer was simple. "I spent my life playing notes. She taught me to play truth, and truth, unlike perfection, is something worth sharing." The conservatory would change too. The Bellamy Wing opened 5 years later, a space designed specifically for blind and visually impaired musicians. Above its entrance, engraved in both text and braille, were the words, "Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of everything waiting to be heard." And for every child who walked through those doors, Arya's legacy whispered the same truth. The world doesn't need your eyes. It needs your voice. It needs you to be unbreakable.